So, elves. I've been researching elves for this video and have come to the realization, and I don't say this lightly, I think elves are forest cats. Magical, elegant, beautiful, and will absolutely knock over your emotional stability if you're not paying attention. Anyway, welcome. Today we're answering the real questions. Why are elves? What are elves? And why do they act like they're the main character in everyone else's story? Spoiler, it's because they think they are. Hello everyone, I'm Sofia, the clever kobold behind the Kobold Guild, your resident gremlin, illustrator, dungeon master, and general lore hoarder. Welcome to D&D Explained Badly, the series where I absolutely roast every species and class in Dungeons & Dragons, while also providing you with a surprising amount of actual research. You know how other channels say, we'll break this down simply and clearly. I say to you, I will explain this to you correctly, but in the voice of someone who hasn't slept since 1997. Today we are, of course, beginning with elves because they are everywhere in every fantasy franchise, every video game, every Pinterest board title forest aesthetic, every 14-year-old's first original character, and every romance subplot in almost every fantasy novel ever written. Elves are essentially the template from which half the fantasy genre was copied and pasted. And also, they're weird, wonderful, insufferable, brilliant, and, well, just elves. And if we're going to dissect a species, we might as well start with the one that radiates the strongest I'm better than you because I'm moisturized kind of energy. So grab your tea, get comfortable, maybe light a little candle, something frosty, get the ambience going. And let's take a long, very long winding walk through the enchanted forest of elf nonsense. So, simple question to start, what actually is an elf in D&D? In the modern 5e, elves are described as graceful, perceptive, magical, wise, emotionally repressed, and physically incapable of walking like a normal human. They glide, they float, they move like the wind itself is holding the edges of their cloak because it has a crush on them. And elves, well, they don't sleep, they just stop. They fold themselves into a neat little meditation pose and enter a trance for 4 hours. And the first time you tell a new player this, you can watch the exact moment they realize they can win every long rest argument forever. Elves are also long-lived, and by long-lived, I mean ridiculously long-lived. Some live to 750 years old. Some reach 1,000. Some don't even bother counting anymore because they've lived through entire human civilizations and honestly can't be bothered to update their Facebook profile. And here's the thing about living that long. You stop panicking. You stop rushing. You stop, caring deeply about anything that isn't a tree, a poem, or the moon. This is why elves feel so emotionally distant. It's not that they don't care, it's that they care in a way that moves at a geological pace. If an elf says, I'll get round to it, they mean sometimes before the next ice age, probably. Similar to Mediterraneans of I'll be there at 7 and they'll turn up at probably midnight. I know that from personal experience with my family. But physically, we're going back to the elves. They are agile, elegant, lithe, except for when they trip in real life, which is almost always at the worst moment and somehow still looks choreographed. And personality-wise, elves are quietly emotional. They just express everything in metaphors or sighs or maybe intense prolonged staring that may or may not be directed to a star that hasn't existed for 200 years. And let's go further back. Let's go through the editions. And it's quite the journey. A timeline full of drama, questionable design choices, emotional damage, and frankly, surprisingly number of novel tie-ins. The very first edition with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was your chaotic start, because elves were well, a lot. You had high elves, wood elves, grey elves, wild elves, valley elves, aquatic elves. You could open a packet of trading cards and probably get a new elf subrace. Every elf came with a bonus, a penalty, a weird cultural quirk, and a paragraph telling you exactly how pretty they were. Early D&D was very into describing elves as beautiful. Mechanically, though, our first lot of elves in Dungeons & Dragons were extremely fragile. They had fantastic dexterity but terrible constitution, and this bizarre tendency meant that they often died if someone sneezed too close to them. But the defining trait was that they could multiclass like absolute machines. If you wanted a fighter mage, that was absolutely fine. A fighter mage thief, why not? A fighter mage thief acrobat, let's go! Early D&D had the vibe of someone excitedly writing by candlelight thinking, yes, them do everything. Elves were elite, rare, noble, dramatic, a little pretentious, and absolutely the blueprint for every fantasy elf archetype after them. We then come to the second edition, or as I like to call it, the novella period. 2E loved elves, and I mean really, really loved elves. This was the era where elves got their cultural books, novels, family sagas, and entire forest-spanning backgrounds. There were chapters about architecture, essays on philosophy, and diagrams of how they farmed magical crops. If you ever want to know what elves eat for breakfast on the third equinox in spring, well, 2E has you covered. This edition also firmly established elves as ancient and magical, with a culture rooted in artistry, nature, and frankly, a concerning amount of melancholy. The stereotype of beautiful, sad elf who stared off into the middle distance, remembering lost worlds, comes directly from here. You then have the third editions, and this was kind of your peak crunchy chaos. 3.5 edition is the edition where elves became manically, well, definitely manically, but mechanically strong, lore-heavy and culturally varied. This is where elves got their sleep immunity, keen sense bonuses, weapon proficiencies, spellcasting flavor, and dozens of sub-races.
What did you say?
Dozens of sub-races. 3.5 had so many elves you could form an entire international committee out of. You had sun elves, moon elves, star elves, copper elves, green elves, red elves, blue elves. Which elf would you pick? It was the Pokemon generation of elf design. This edition also made Drow absolutely pop off. Charisma, magic resistance, powerful spell-like abilities, and a tragic, dramatic culture. Drow absolutely stole the spotlight, and honestly, good for them. Though we won't touch on the controversy of what they were based on. Anyway, moving over, we come to the fourth edition, the Elven Split. This is where D&D officially divorced the elves. Elves became woodsy, agile, nature-tied wanderers, whilst their Feywild cousins, the Eldarin, became magical and huge drama queens who could teleport mid-conversation. So if you've ever been overstimulated and just wanted to leave, well, the Eldarin race is the one for you. You'd then have the Drow, who remained iconic, but now enriched with even more structured Feywild lore. You'd then have the 5th edition and beyond. Well, 5e elves, finally, they have the aesthetic darlings of this edition. They are graceful, mystical, approachable, still dramatic, and Tasha's removed ability score restrictions let elves become strong, charismatic, or just chaotic gremlin coded. And then in 22 to 2024, introduced the Trance memory rule, which meant that elves, whilst they were chancing, could dive down into their biological hard drives and capable of recalling other people's memories, which is honestly quite terrifying. I can't imagine wanting to watch kind of a movie on my ancestors, but it's still a very cool niche idea. let's talk about the real-world inspirations for elves, because D&D didn't create these creatures out of thin air. They were borrowed, adapted, stitched together, and occasionally bedazzled with glitter by Tolkien. They are effectively the fantasy equivalent of Frankenstein's monster. The word elf itself goes all the way back to early Germanic and Norse cultures. These weren't your whimsical Disney fae creatures we see today. The Elfi in Norse mythology were powerful, luminous beings associated with nature, beauty, magic, healing, and quite often, well, danger. They weren't necessarily benevolent. They did what they wanted. They could bless you or they could traumatize yourself. Well, you probably could, but they could traumatize you. Very on brand for the elves. Then we get to the Celtic Osai, who were essentially immortal spirits living alongside humanity, but not quite interacting with them daily. They lived in ancient mounds, underground realms, and the Twilight Worlds. They were beautiful, mysterious, and morally ambiguous, and had a fondness for kidnapping children who were just minding their own business. This is where you get the changeling. And honestly, if a Victorian painter said, "This forest spirit stole my wife and replaced her with a changeling," well, the Osai would be like, yes, we did. Germanic folklore added another layer. Elves sometimes caused illness, mischief, or sleep paralysis. If you woke up with a mysterious ache or a weird dream, people used to say an elf sat on you. D&D did not keep that part, though. And imagine if they had. You could take 2d6 psychic damage because an elf thought it would be funny. And then Tolkien arrived like a university professor with too much time and says, actually, elves were tall, elegant, immortal, poetic, and kind of depressed. And the fantasy genre since then just went, yes, yeah, absolutely, that. And thus, the modern elf aesthetic was born. But now that we've covered the very respectable lore, let's put that aside and talk about elves the way most adventurers actually experience them. Badly. Elves are basically, number 1, cats who learnt archery. 2, your immortals, theatre kids. 3, people who absolutely believe that spirituality and things are completely real. 4, the spiritual cousin of that friend who goes on long walks just to find themselves. 5, they are emotionally constipated. And 6, too pretty for their own good. 7, they are allergic to urgency and prefer to go, let's just sit for a while. And finally, the reason why rangers never get a day off. Imagine a creature who can live for 800 years, but still refuses to do the washing up. That is an elf. Elves also have that very specific kind of confidence where they act like they know everything. But if you ask them a direct question, they answer with a poem instead. For example, you would go, "Why are the orcs attacking the forest?" And the elf would answer, "When the moon wanes, so too does the patience of the earth." When you follow it up with, "Okay, but like tactically," they would just simply go, "The leaves whisper their secrets on the wind." And so you're left with, "Okay, I'll go ask someone else." And they say it with such sincerity, like it actually helped you. Elves treat time like a suggestion. You say, "Meet me at dawn," and they hear, "Arrive somewhere between now and the next solstice." Let's get practical. After following how we can see where they come from, let's think about how do we play an elf without falling into stereotypes or worse, becoming annoying. And here are my favourite ways to roleplay elves based on decades of D&D lore and the emotional chaos of my players. Number 1, slow down your reactions. Elves don't rush. If someone bursts into the room yelling, "Danger!" the elf would blink slowly and said, "Yes, I sensed that 20 minutes ago." And number 2, think in centuries, not days. Elves don't panic about deadlines. They panic about deforestation, the slow decay of ancient magic, and probably their own hair. The stress exists on a completely different timeline. So when people say that you have to get to a place in just a couple of days, the elves aren't thinking about that. They'll get there in time. Number 3, they have hobbies. Deep, obsessive hobbies. Elves are autistic coded, and I will die on this hill. They latch onto niche interests and study until they become an expert, whether it be stars, herbs, dance, sword forms, history, and beekeeping. Your elf should have one weird subject they care about way too much, and might even go on tangents and try and bring in that topic with every single time they talk to someone. Number 4, they struggle with blunt emotions. Elves feel things deeply, but they don't show it directly. If your elf is upset, they won't cry. They'll go for a walk in the rain or sing an old song or maybe stare at the horizon dramatically. Take a moment to stand and breathe, or maybe just stare for an unblinking long time. And number 5, elves are gently sarcastic. They have lived for a very long time, and with that you get trauma. Think dry, slow, savage, sarcastic British humour, and make it even more polite and maybe add a poetic metaphor in there. Number 6, elves don't brag. They simply are. Humans brag. Elves mention they mastered 4 types of magic, like they've been telling you about a new sandwich shop they found. Just imagine, humans to elves are like dogs to us. We pass very quickly, and so for elves, when they say that, oh yes, I mastered those 4 types of magic in my first 2 centuries, whilst the human is bragging about, I am a master, well, they're not trying to condescend you, even if it feels that way. It's more of a case of that they don't see it as an impressive feat. Number 7, being immortal means they are terrible at flirting. Elves flirt like Victorian poets. Everything is subtle metaphors. The lingering looks and hands that brush that last a bit too long. They say things like, your presence stirs the leaves of my heart. And the party rogue is like, okay, but do you want to get drinks or not? And now, we will dive into the sub-races. Elves come in so many flavours that could make a Ben & Jerry's line out of them. So let's go through the big ones with some depth, because I'm getting tired, so it's not going to be completely in-depth. You have, first and foremost, the High Elves. These are your scholars, mages, and the I read books for fun type. Often the stereotype of fancy, nose-in-the-air magical aristocrats, but 5e did make them seem a little bit more grounded as an option, though the majority of people that play them do play them as fancy, nose-in-the-air magical aristocrats. You then have the Wood Elves. These are the forest cousins of the High Elves. These are your runners, archers, and rangers that are more feral than fancy. They're great at hiding, don't like socializing with strangers, and probably smell like moss and judgment. Your Eldarin are your season-based Feywild elves whose personality literally changes with the seasons. With spring they flirt, in summer they fight, autumn they reflect, and in winter, well, they cry. Then we have the Drow. These are your goth elves. They are dramatic and powerful, unafraid of any spiders. They will happily show you their pet spider. And they are fashionable to a fault, and also canonically bisexual. The women lead this culture, and the men come second. And if you played Baldur's Gate 3 with Minthara, well, the third sons are useless. Then you have the Shadowkai. These are your Shadowfell elves who have survived 3 wars and definitely, absolutely don't need any therapy, and it absolutely didn't help when they tried. Their favourite hobby is brooding on rooftops. And then we have the Sea Elves, which are basically just the same as High Elves, but they are constantly damp. These have elves with seaweed hair and a love for coral and maybe have a pet fish or crab. Then we finally come to the pallid elves. These are your moonlit elves who look like they stepped out of an anime scene and enjoy stargazing, soft lighting, and a touch of melancholy. We now enter the Kobold Court. All right, elves, step forward. Your charges stand at being too pretty, making mortals feel insecure, using bows extensively, taking 200 years to decide on anything, and looking fabulous while doing nothing, which is just outrageous. Our Kobold Court verdict is guilty on all charges. You are sentenced to 100 years of emotional vulnerability training. But in conclusion, elves are the most iconic fantasy species for a reason. They're mysterious, ancient, beautiful, dramatic, insufferable, poetic, deeply emotional, and sometimes terrifying, sometimes soft, but always compelling. They are the quiet backbone of D&D lore, and the reason every bard develops a crust. Crust? A bard develops a crust.
I have no idea what you just said.
No. Bard develops a crust. At least once. Thank you so much for joining me on the first episode of D&D Explained Badly. I apologise for the many times I have stumbled over words and probably mispronounced many things. But please tell me in the comments, who should we tackle next? Dwarfs, tieflings, dragonborn, tabaxi, gnomes, or bards? And bards scare me, but I'll do it. And make sure you like, subscribe, feed a kobold today, and stay hydrated. I'm Sofia from the Kobold Guild. Stay creative, stay chaotic, and I'll see you in the next episode.